All right, everybody. It is me again. I get the opportunity to introduce Seth. So, welcome to the session, What is Calea? Seth Ritter has deep roots in rural Northwest Kansas and offers a unique perspective on the telecommunications industry, having served in various capacities at Nex-Tech. As a Calea compliance expert, he works with hundreds of broadband service providers throughout the U.S. Seth holds a bachelor's degree in business administration, and as a small town city council member, he understands the challenges rural America faces and its need for good broadband services. So, welcome, Seth.
Thank you, Maggie. I want to follow up on your last one. Here you go.
Oh, yeah.
There's some of the cartoonists that she was talking about. Definitely a better picture of me than real life, but that's what we have. So thanks for the introduction, Maggie. Once I saw the schedule, I knew I was going to have to go out after you. I thought, well, that's a tough act to follow, but then I figured, you probably had everybody warmed up for me. So I appreciate everybody joining. 2021 seems like making up time for 2020. I know that time is valuable. There's a lot going on. So anytime you're spending with us, we definitely appreciate it. With that in mind, whenever I was going through this, I wanted to make this kind of fun, entertaining, and hopefully informative. I know that I definitely learned some things when I was putting this together. So I hope you guys enjoy it and learn a thing or two. And I'm just going to kind of jump into it. One thing about Calea, whenever I sit and talk with people is, first of all, it's what is Calea? A lot of people aren't really aware. They don't see it happen, in the background. And the second part is intercepts. Intercepts don't actually happen. Calea warrants don't actually happen. Or I remember when Calea came out in mid 2000s, but I haven't seen it since. And as a trusted third party, we do actually see intercepts come through. We see them come through probably on average once a month. Sometimes we have two or more going on at one time. Sometimes we don't have any. And it's all across the map, all across the United States. Alaska, Puerto Rico is where we have customers. And I wanted to tell one of those stories. The problem is I don't know a lot of our stories. I can tell you where some have happened, but I can't tell you what happened after them, or a lot of it's kind of confidential. So I was looking for one of those to kind of go through an actual intercept, and I did find one. This is not one that we've done, but this is one that was in the news, and it started with these two buildings here. So I wanted to share it, and if you guess what these two buildings had in common, good for you. There's an old fire station in Kansas City, Kansas, and a Granddaddy's barbecue joint in Lawrence, Kansas. And if you guess that they were a part of a multi-million-dollar, multi-state drug ring, then you're a really, really good guesser. I don't have any prizes for you, but they will give away some prizes at the end. Maybe you'll win one. Involved in this was also a carpet cleaning business, a tanning salon. There was this huge drug enterprise. I couldn't find pictures of those buildings. I don't know if they're in witness protection or what, but couldn't find those. So all I had was these two to go off. And how this story starts was there was two brothers. Their names were Los and Roosevelt Dada. Actually, they had changed their name. They were born Eric and Derek Wallace. They changed their name in early 2000. Nobody really seems to know why, but they changed it. They were in trouble with the law, regardless of what their names were. They were just getting out of jail in the 2000s. And as any good criminals do, they decided to set up another criminal enterprise. And this time it was hauling marijuana, mostly, a little cocaine, from California over into Kansas, into eastern Kansas, to be more specific. And like I said, they had a great little drug ring going on here. And as happens whenever I've never done it, but what I've seen in movies and what you read about whenever somebody has a drug enterprise, typically the lower level people aren't the brightest bulbs, and they end up getting caught with arms or drugs or whatever, and they start rolling over. And to get out of trouble, they start rolling over on the guys in the upper tiers. So local law enforcement around Lawrence, they were hearing more and more about these Dada brothers. So they kind of were looking into it. They started talking with the DEA. The DEA is like, yeah, I think this is something we should look into. So as they started gathering more and more information, I'm sure what happened is the DEA, and this happens, we see this all the time. Law enforcement agencies, they'll go to the carrier, and whether it's data or whether it's phone numbers or cell phones in this case, they'll say, hey, we have these numbers. We want to know who they called and who's called them. And that's usually how it starts. It's a subpoena for historical records. They have to have a court document for that. So I'm sure they went to the cell phone carrier, whoever that was, and said, we'd like to see who these people are calling. So they did that. As they gathered that information, and as it went along further, then they end up gathering enough information to say, okay, now it's time. We need to do a lawful intercept. We need to do a wiretap on these two guys' cell phones. We've got enough information to go say they're probably doing some bad stuff. We need to figure out just exactly how bad it is. So they went back, they went to a federal judge in Kansas. They end up getting a warrant. So what I'm sure happened is they came back with the warrant, went to the carrier. The carrier probably had a trusted third party of some sort, or they had some other Calea mechanism in place. And they said, okay, here's the two numbers that we need live intercepts of. We're going to listen to their conversations. And the trusted third party probably came in and said, okay, we're going to handle that. We've got this in place. We've taken steps to be ready for these kind of things. And if it's a large carrier, they see these all the time. So they've got somebody that they work with and they know how to do it. So they get the warrant in place, trusted third party, or however they're doing it behind the scenes. They're listening to these calls. And something that I found interesting is not only were they listening to these calls, these guys weren't complete idiots. They weren't saying, drop the drugs off on 10th and Summer Street and old Joe's going to come over and bring you $10,000. Like that's not how they were talking. They had code words for everything they were doing. They had code words for drugs. They had code words for cash, code words for where they were going to spend the night, things like that. It was all over the place. So they actually had to spend 5 months listening to these two guys, and they ended up getting warrants to do lawful intercepts or wiretaps on 7 other phones. So they were doing 9 wiretaps at one time for this whole drug ring. And as it went, they end up finally 5 months down the road, they got enough evidence to go ahead and start. They just did a bust. They came in, they started making arrests. 43-person indictment out of this thing. $17 million in drug proceeds were seized. So needless to say, the Dada brothers were in just a little bit of trouble. This actually went to the Supreme Court. That's why you could find some information on it. And the reason why it went to the Supreme Court is the Dada brothers, they're like, hey, we know you had a wiretap, but it was in Kansas. The federal judge was in Kansas. We were running drugs out of California. That's out of your jurisdiction. And the Court of Appeals actually kind of agreed with that, but they said, we agree that it was probably out of jurisdiction, but you're still going to jail. And the Supreme Court essentially said the same thing. They kind of disagreed with the lower court, but these guys are still in jail, and so you don't really have to worry about them too much. So with that being said, I was going through that story and I found it very interesting. And I was like, well, how did we get here? How did we get to where we're now tapping, listening in on cell phone calls, and surely we had to start, at landlines or whatever. So I really wanted to look into that. And I came across this picture, cartoon. I'm sure it was a depiction of the NSA kind of spying, fiasco that went on. And Lady Justice is back there saying, hey, we probably need to talk about some civil liberties things here. But this is what it was like before some of these laws started getting enacted. As landlines were becoming more and more popular in the 60s, about 80% of households had landlines. Before this act, law enforcement kind of had free reign, and they were abusing it a little bit. They were going in, wiretapping, doing whatever, and bringing it to court when, the citizen didn't really have any knowledge of it. And finally, Congress decided, hey, there should probably some protection under the Fourth Amendment for this. So that's how this Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 came about, also known as the Wiretap Act. I don't know why they couldn't just call it that. Congress has to make everything difficult, but so the Wiretap Act came about, and basically what the Wiretap Act said is, hey, you've got to get a warrant before you start listening in on phone calls and using those against people in court. So that was the very start of it. There's been several of these laws that have come in, several offshoots of all of these. I'm just going to kind of give you the main ones that I came across in my research. After the Wiretap Act, there was the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986. And this was really when email was starting to become a thing. Data communications was starting to become a thing. And they also needed protection, because if you don't spell things out, sometimes, that'll get abused. So this is where this came into play. And another thing was, stored communication at that time, whether it was phone numbers that somebody had called or had called a certain phone number. If it was historical data, law enforcement didn't really need a subpoena, didn't really need a court order or a warrant or anything to get that information. They could just go get it. And this put in place that they would have to have something to be able to get that information. That part of it has kind of gone back and forth. I see some where now they don't really need a warrant or subpoena, but sometimes they do. So that one's kind of gone back and forth. But as I kind of mentioned, back in the 60s or whatever, wiretapping was easy. But as telephony networks progressed, as broadband became a thing, law enforcement and digital switches were becoming a thing. Law enforcement actually needed a little more teeth. It was wiretapping and lawful intercepts. They were harder to do. And so mostly the FBI is the one that really pushed this. They're like, hey, we need some help. If we want to be able to listen in on somebody's phone call or, gather some of this information, it's harder to do. We can't just go up there and pin the wires and listen. So they end up coming up with Calea. Finally, they came up with something, Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, that, is easy to say. Calea is a lot easier to say. So past that in 1994, like I said, it was just mostly for digital switches, for it to become easier for them to be able to look into those. 2005, they ended up, adapting it for data as internet service providers were popping up and internet was really taking off. Law enforcement saw some bad actors within there, and they figured, we need to be able to monitor that data, and it's difficult. Like I said, just same thing with digital switches. It's very difficult to do. You have to have the know-how, or there's certain equipment you have to have in place to be able to do those things. So as these things came along, then there was the need for like a trusted third party or something else to be able to facilitate those. And as a service provider, you'd be looking at it saying, okay, well, I know how they'd look up a phone call and how they get in touch with somebody, figure out who that is. But as a service provider, how are they going to know who the bad actor is on the internet? And first of all, the federal government probably knows more than you think they do. So that's just one thing. But second of all, they'll have an IP address of what that criminal or bad actor, or what they suspect, what they think is doing some bad things. They'll have the IP address of what they were doing. They'll go and look it up on the ARIN registry. And within that ARIN registry, the internet service provider will be listed. Just a rule of thumb, we always have our customers go in and look at that information, because usually it's outdated. Usually there's people's names on there that don't work for the company or anymore. So if you have that, you may want to go check that out. But that's how they'll find you. And like I said, when we talked about the Dada story, what happens is usually it'll just be a subpoena. They'll come to you with a subpoena and they'll say, we need to know who had this IP address at this given time. And this is really where our breadbasket is. It's data communications where that we help facilitate with our Calea service. And once they get that historical data, or sometimes they ask for historical data from a year and a half ago, and some service providers, they just don't have that. It was so long ago. So if you don't have it, you just got to tell them, look, I don't have it. But they may force you to keep those records moving forward. But then what will happen is they'll come to you with a warrant. And this is really where Nex-Tech and our trusted third party comes into play. We will handle that warrant. We will do if you want to handle the warrant, you can. But most providers, when they get the warrant, they're just like, get this out of my hand. I don't really want to talk to the FBI. I'll let you guys handle it. So we can handle the warrant validation. We're going to make sure it's valid warrant from a valid FBI agent or whatever ongoing case. Then as we proceed with it, we're going to actually put that probe within your network, or we're going to figure out how we're going to get that data in real time to that law enforcement agency. If you're a current customer of ours, we've probably already got a plan. We probably talked on the phone. I'm sure you've heard from me. And we've got that plan in place in case something ever happens. You can just call us up and we're going to be there to help with that. Something that people don't really think about, going back to the story at the beginning, you have to actively monitor to make sure that data or those phone calls are going and making their way to the law enforcement agency, because we've had situations where all of a sudden there's no data stream and we're like, is it us? Is a connection loss with the service provider? So we've got to figure out what's going on, or maybe the bad guy just left and he's not around anymore. So, and he's not using the internet. So we've got to figure out what that is. And most of the time we actually catch it before the FBI catches it. And, as I mentioned, a lot of service providers, they want to worry about providing services. They don't want to worry about having to deal with the FBI or anything else. And the one thing that we do, whether it's a customer or whether it's a potential customer, or you just want to talk, learn more about Calea, we'll do a free compliance assessment. And we've had calls with people and we've said, looks like, you don't have your own IP space. Your IP addresses come from your upstream provider, and you don't actually need our service, because if you don't have your own IP space, it's going to be on that upstream provider to handle that Calea service. Or we've had calls where we've looked at their compliance situation and they're paying less, or they've got a good solution in place. So it's like, hey, you've got a good solution in place. I would suggest you keep it. But for the most part, we end up in a situation where we can help them, and if they want to move forward with it, then we go from there. So really, what Nex-Tech does is they make Calea compliance easy. It's just as simple as, if you get a warrant, you pass it over to us. We're going to handle everything from talking with the law enforcement agency to putting up the probe or setting up whatever lawful intercept device it's going to be. And that's how we take care of it. So if you have any questions on this, just let me know. Or you have any questions on Calea in general, don't hesitate to reach out. Maggie, is there any questions for me from that? It looks like there's some.
Yeah, there's a little bit of activity on the chat screen, but do definitely have a couple of questions for you. What relationship, if any, does Calea have with DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act?
So that's a really good question. None. Those are actually two separate, two different things. So the Calea is obviously what I went through, but the DMCA is when somebody is within your network and they're illegally downloading Game of Thrones or some Disney show or whatever. If you're a service provider, I'm sure you've seen these notices that come in either from Sony or whoever from Disney, and they'll say such and such, or they'll give you an IP address or whatever is using this, they're downloading this illegally. And it's your job as a service provider to pass that along, because if you don't, you can actually be held liable. There was a lawsuit with Cox where they learned a lesson the hard way about DMCA. So if you're a service provider, you're getting those, you have to pass those along. And then eventually, if the offender keeps abusing it, then you're going to have to shut them off, because like I said, as that service provider, you are liable.
Gotcha. Okay. What type of penalty is there for failing to be Calea compliant?
Well, it's a good question. There's a couple of different things, but really they have it written within the law that you can be fined up to $10,000 per day for lack of Calea compliance. I don't know that would happen based on our conversations that we've had with the FBI. It would have to be a gross negligence on the service provider's perspective to be able to get that kind of fine. I mean, you'd have to get the warrant and then just throw it in the trash, basically not listen to them, or not work with them at all. So usually whenever we work with them, we don't have any issues handling anything, and they're pretty good to work with, but they can levy some hefty fines. And then they can also come in and say, hey, your network needs to be Calea compliant by this day. So those are the penalties.